All right. Good evening. Thanks for joining me this evening. You might be able to tell by the look behind me here, I'm not in my normal location this week. I am actually on the road. Let me begin. I'm Ron Williams, certified professional recovery coach, and I am the host of Let's Talk Recovery. And so I'm not in my normal location tonight. I'm actually on the road this week. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri this week. And so things are a little different for me and my setup here. And yeah, but everything should go smoothly for me tonight. But things are a little bit different. And but I got everything started and we're here. And I'm glad that you're with me this evening. And so, last week, I want to mention last week I had a guest with me, Betsy Wright. We talked about trauma. We had some really good conversation. Betsy was a trauma expert. And we had a conversation last week about trauma. What is trauma and how does it affect us? And we received some comments during the live last week about the possibility of a follow-up conversation where we could dig a little bit deeper into our discussion of trauma. And we are hoping to do that, maybe putting that together here maybe in May or June. We'll talk about that and see what we can get lined up. I do have guests coming up in the near future, coming up in April. I try to have a live guest once a month coming up in April. I will have a guest. He is a police officer with the Louisville, Kentucky Police Department. And he will be with me to discuss the relationship between crime and addiction, and specifically homelessness and addiction. He works with a task force in Louisville that works directly with the homeless population there. And he'll be with me to talk about that coming up in April. And so, anyway, I do want to ask, as you come in tonight into the live, or if you watch this after it's posted on one of my other social media platforms, when you come in, if you don't mind just sharing where you're joining us from, so I can get an idea of where people are watching from. And I want to invite you, if you end up having any comments or any questions, feel free to stick those into the chat here on Facebook Live. Or you can leave comments on the other platforms. This will be posted later tonight on my YouTube channel. And we will respond to comments and to questions that you might have. It's good to see you, Blast. Good to see you here with me this evening. Always good to see you. All right, tonight, the topic that we have tonight is we are going to talk about relapse. We have a couple specific things we're going to talk about with relapse. In the recovery world, a lot of people think that relapse begins when somebody takes a drink, when somebody uses that drug of choice again, or when somebody watches porn or engages in unhealthy behavior. Many people believe that it's in that moment that relapse takes place. Relapse is viewed more as an event um, a specific time and action that takes place that gets labeled as relapse. And a lot of times, as I discuss with people, with clients, or with others, and as they talk about relapse, um, they, I'll ask them, I'll always ask questions like, what led up to the relapse? What kind of things changed in your recovery leading up to the relapse? What were you feeling? What were you thinking about? What's been going on in the days and weeks leading up to your acting out? And a lot of times the response that I receive is, well, nothing happened. Everything was going really well. And then all of a sudden I took a drink. All of a sudden I used drugs. I looked at porn. I acted out sexually, whatever the behavior is that that the person is in recovery for. And I don't have any doubt that that's what they believe, is that everything was going great and all of a sudden relapse just happened. But that's not the way that relapse works. And that's a part of what we're going to be talking about this evening. The idea that relapse is not an event. It's not that moment when you pick up that drink or when you act out. Relapse almost always begins long before the behavior manifests again. And so tonight we're going to talk about where relapse really begins and how to recognize relapse early on so that we can put a plan in place and we can utilize tools to see to it that relapse doesn't take place, that we don't follow through. So if relapse only began with the behavior, if it only began with the drink or with the drug use or with the acting out in whatever way, well, then the answer would be just to avoid the behavior. But again, relapse starts usually weeks or sometimes even months earlier. And so the common misunderstanding that's taking place here in our thinking has to do with the idea that relapse is an event. The actual event, the actual behavior, the instance when we act out, that is actually the end of the relapse process, not the beginning. And we need to begin to recognize it as such, that drink, that behavior, that watching porn or acting out sexually, that gambling, whatever the struggle is that we have, that behavior is the end of the relapse process, not the beginning. And we've got to begin to shift our thinking to recognize that and to prepare for it and to look at things from that perspective. Behavior is usually the last step in the process. Long before that behavior takes place, something else has already started happening internally. Relapse begins in our thoughts. Relapse begins in our emotions. It begins in our attitude, and our attitude changes. It begins with disconnection, with withdrawal, and are beginning to move into isolation. And that can play out in so many ways. And we'll talk about a few of those things tonight. So with these things, all of these things, thoughts, emotions, attitudes, disconnection, really the core, the common thing through all that is that idea of disconnection. And the thought that relapse begins with disconnection. And it's disconnection from specific things. We begin to disconnect from our feelings. We stop checking in with ourselves on what we're feeling. We begin to experience anxiety, or we begin to experience anger or shame. Maybe even, one of the common things is shame. We feel tempted. We have a thought about what we used to experience with our behavior and with our acting out. We have a thought, and maybe we immediately step into that thought of, I should be farther than this by now. I shouldn't be tempted like this anymore. I shouldn't be thinking about wanting to do something like that. And as soon as our thoughts move in that direction, that triggers shame. And shame triggers a desire to isolate. Because when we experience shame, the healthy response to shame is to bring that shame into the light. The healthy response is to check those feelings in with our sponsor, with our group, if we're active in a group. I encourage people to be active in a group. We need a community where we can be open and honest without fear of shame, without fear of judgment. And so when we experience that shame, when we experience those thoughts and those feelings, the immediate response should be, the healthy response is to bring those feelings into the light, to bring that shame into the light. When shame is brought into the light, shame loses its power and its control over us. But the normal response, the unhealthy response, which is the normal response for most people, is when we experience shame, we move towards isolation. So back to where I started. I'm getting off on a little bit of a ramble there, but what I'm saying is accurate. What I'm saying is true, but we begin, relapse begins with disconnection from our feelings. And again, shame, anger, fear, or anxiety, any of the feelings that we might experience. And those feelings are normal. The way to process those feelings is to bring them out into the light, in community. We disconnect from honesty. I've talked with 4 or 5 people in just the last couple of days about that idea of honesty. I was talking to a young man this weekend about that, it was actually at a church service. I'm here in St. Louis, and I was visiting a church on Sunday. And a young man was talking to me after the service, and he was asking about some things, and I began to share about the importance of community and recovery. And I asked him, I said, what is the one question that everybody asks when you walk into the building here on Sunday mornings? And I didn't have to lead him or anything. He just immediately said, everybody wants to know, hey, how you doing? I said, exactly. We get asked that question all the time. And then I asked him, and what was your response? And he kind of smiled and he said, well, I'm fine. I'm fine. And then we talked about that. That's really the person that's asking the question, how are you doing? That's what they want to hear. They're not expecting you to begin to open up about what you're feeling and how life is going. They want to be able to share that they're fine, and they want to hear that you're fine, and then they want to move on and avoid openness and avoid real community, real intimacy with one another. And so we disconnect from honesty. We disconnect from healthy relationships. Those are those relationships where we can be open and honest without fear of judgment, now without fear of shame. And if you're thinking in this moment, I don't have that kind of relationship, I don't know that I have people in my life like that, that's one of the reasons why I encourage people to check out groups, recovery groups. You can find communities. You can find, I'm not saying you walk into a meeting, whether it's AA or NA or SA or whatever the meeting is. I'm not saying you walk into a meeting and everybody there is just open and honest. That's not what I'm saying. But there will be people there that are. And you need to identify who those people are, and you need connection. And we also disconnect, we begin to disconnect from our recovery practices. In one of the groups that I attend, a meeting that I attend every night, in one of the readings, it talks about, specifically about daily disciplines. And there are daily disciplines that are present in my life. Daily disciplines that are present in my recovery. And those disciplines are more than, they're not less than, but they're more than just reading my Bible or praying. And both of those things for me are a part of my daily discipline. But there's more to my daily discipline than that. My daily disciplines include things like daily readings. I do read from my Bible. I read from recovery material. It even involves things, my daily disciplines include things like a commitment to rest and to sleep. One of my daily disciplines is I will get 7 hours or more of sleep every night. That's a discipline that's at place in my life because it's something that I've identified. When I get less than that, I begin to struggle. I struggle emotionally and my recovery begins to struggle. I'm not in a healthy place. So, recovery practices, daily disciplines. We disconnect from feelings, from honesty, from healthy relationships, and from recovery practices. And there are several common early signs that we're moving towards potential relapse or potential acting out. And some of those, we'll walk through some of those common signs, early signs. The first is isolation. We become less committed to our group if we attend a group regularly. We begin to limit our healthy interactions with people in our life. We begin to isolate. We don't open up in honesty about our struggles, about what we're feeling, about what's going on in our lives. We pull away from people. We miss meetings. We start skipping check-ins. Check-ins are an important part of my recovery. And it's an important part of the recovery of most people that I know that are successful. They do check-ins. We begin to avoid accountability. We become dishonest. If we are doing any kind of check-in, we maybe begin to hide a few things and to cover up a few things. And what we need to understand is that addiction loves isolation. Addiction and isolation walk hand in hand. And if we are in recovery and we find ourselves beginning to isolate, if we find ourselves not openly communicating our struggles, our feelings, we need also to be communicating our wins and those things that are going well in our life. But if we begin to move towards isolation and we identify that, that needs to be setting off alarm bells in our heads. We are moving towards potential relapse. A second common early sign that we're moving, that we're beginning to drift towards relapse, is distraction. And this is something that I sometimes get some pushback on, but here's my thought here: distraction. We begin to push ourselves to stay busy. Now, I will say this: early in recovery, sometimes busyness can be a good thing early in recovery. But for some people, when we begin to struggle, when we begin to isolate, when we begin to back off 1 hour daily disciplines, what ends up happening is that as we pull away from our regular disciplines, we begin to speed up. We begin to substitute busyness for real recovery work. And that busyness might look like a number of things. That busyness can be that all of a sudden I find myself scrolling on my phone. Doesn't matter whether it's news, social media, doesn't make any difference what it is, but I begin to occupy any free time that I have with things like scrolling or gaming. Sometimes there are several people that I know that gaming is something that they'll turn to distract themselves. We begin to watch more TV, even work, and work is a good thing, but we can begin to pour ourselves into work where we're spending more and more time at work as a means of keeping ourselves busy. And the line of thought there is, I need to keep myself so busy that I don't have time to act out. And I hear people use those exact words. And maybe you've heard people use those words. Maybe you've used those words yourself. And that idea of busyness, keeping myself so busy that I don't have time to act out. I don't have time to use. I don't have time to get in trouble. And that gets us into trouble because when we begin to move into those distractions, that busy work, what we're attempting to do is we're attempting to avoid our uncomfortable feelings. We're attempting to avoid those things that we're struggling with in our head. And busy work can only last for so long because we wear ourselves out. Eventually, we exhaust ourselves, we wear ourselves down, and we end up in relapse because we're trying to distract ourselves with busyness. A third area is emotional buildup. It's when we start to withdraw from our feelings and our emotions. And we don't take the time to process our feelings and our emotions. I'm talking about emotions like anger or shame, Emotions like loneliness, stress, resentment. We experience these feelings, these emotions, and these things are a normal part of life. Everybody feels these things. There are a lot of us in recovery that experience loneliness. There are a lot of us in recovery that are single. A lot of us struggle with anger. We struggle with shame, with resentment. Bill W. talks about resentment. Bill W. said that resentment is the number one offender, that resentment is the number one cause of relapse for an alcoholic. And I can't speak to that specifically, but I can tell you that resentment plays a major role in relapse. And these things build up because we cease to process our feelings and our emotions. We know that we're angry, but we don't bother to ask ourselves why. And a lot of things can push us there. It can be anger with ourselves, it can be anger with other people. It can be things like politics. Politics is a big one. Politics has been a big one for the last few years. Doesn't matter which party you're in. Politics, I've come across 2 studies that have not made clear connections, but that suggest that politics are playing here in the last 2 or 3 years, politics are playing a much larger role in relapse with addiction. Now, why is that? It's because the news, social media, politicians, they sell their cause, they push their momentum based on fear and anger. If they can make you angry, if they can make you fearful, boy, if that other party gets elected, if they get in control, then our country's doomed. And both sides play that game big time. Both sides do. It's not that one party is worse at doing that than the other. It's both. And we allow these things to go unprocessed. So what does it look like to process them? Well, it may mean that we sit down and we acknowledge the feelings. Some of you know I've talked about it a lot in these lives. The daily check-in process that I use and that I recommend to my clients, we check in daily with ourselves and with others with 4 questions. What am I feeling? There we are, right there, unprocessed emotions. What am I feeling? What am I thinking about today? What's on my mind? What has my attention captured? What am I feeling and thinking? What have I been doing today? Who have I been around? Where have I been? Sometimes those things play a big role. Specific people may trigger us or get us angry or begin to make it easy for us to walk in resentment. Feeling, thinking, doing, and thinking of doing. What am I worried about that's coming up tomorrow or the next day or this week? That idea of future tripping, getting caught up in things that aren't even here yet. But I'll lose track of what's happening in the present because I'm so focused on things that I'm concerned about that are in the future. So, unprocessed emotions. When emotions build without being processed, the brain starts looking for relief. And when we talked, I think, a few weeks ago, we talked a little bit about some brain science behind how our brain operates. When we allow emotions to build up, things like anger, shame, resentment, that triggers the equivalent of a fire alarm in our brain. Our brain even though we're not processing our emotions, when we don't process, our brain sets off a fire alarm, potential danger. And it puts us mentally, it puts our base emotions on alert for self-defense, causes our frontal lobes to begin to go off of line so we don't think logically and rationally. And we're ready for that fight, flight, or freeze response. And our brain begins to look for relief from that. And let's be honest, that's what our addictions are about. Our addictions are about finding a way to bypass the healthy work, the right way to process what's going on in life. And our addictions are about a quick fix to relieve us from stress and anger, loneliness, shame, resentment. And so our brain begins to look at that, and our brain is already aware of those behaviors that we've used in the past to medicate and to find relief in those areas. The fourth way, the fourth early sign that we're moving towards relapse is secret thinking. Our thought patterns begin to change. As we begin to drift towards relapse, and I'm not talking in the moments before we act out, I'm talking about in the days and weeks before we act out. Thought patterns begin to change. Thoughts begin to cross our mind, things like, well, maybe it wouldn't be that bad. Maybe if I just drank a little. Maybe if I just acted out this one time to help me get some sleep tonight. We begin to rationalize, well, I deserve something. I deserve relief. And we begin to tell ourselves things like, I can do this and nobody will ever know. The problem, though, isn't that somebody else might know. The problem is, if we do it, we're going to know. And what's that going to trigger inside of us? I've talked to people here just this week that have shared with me, I relapsed this week. And every single person that I've talked to that has shared that with me has gone on to talk about the shame that they experienced when they gave in. Now, before we give in, we're not thinking about the shame. We're not thinking about the problems. It's back to that idea. We're thinking about relief from these unprocessed feelings, these things we aren't dealing with, and we're choosing not to deal with. But when it happens, shame is always present. And what's that shame do? We mentioned it earlier. Shame always pushes us towards isolation. It pulls us away from healthy interactions with others. Almost always, the relapse begins in our minds, in our heads, the way we think, the way we talk to ourselves. Now, why does all this matter? Why do these things that I'm talking about here matter? Well, It matters because what most of us tend to do when we're in our addiction, and then also when we're in our recovery, is what we tend to do is we focus on the behavior. And when we focus on the behavior, we miss the warning signs. When we focus on the behavior, we miss the real cause that's in the background. You've heard me say many times, if you've been here with me on these lives, you've heard me say many times, behind every behavior is a feeling. And behind every feeling is a need. And many times, most of the time, those needs are valid. We just don't know how to meet that need in a healthy way. And what we tend to do is we focus on the behavior, because the behavior is where we experience the pain and the discomfort in the immediate. But if we only focus on the behavior, we miss the warning signs that can help us to catch things early and avoid the big problems. And when we focus on that behavior, recovery becomes reactive instead of proactive. We wait and react to what's taking place instead of proactively recognizing that there's a problem, that some of our tools and disciplines need to be put back in place, and we can avoid the behavior and the potential problem that's on its way. And if we recognize the early stages of relapse, things like we've been talking about, isolation, dropping our daily disciplines, moving towards distraction, that idea of scrolling or gaming, anything that keeps us busy. We trade real recovery for that idea of keeping myself so busy that I can't do anything bad. And this is why tools like daily check-ins are so important. And I am a believer in daily check-ins. If somebody says, well, I do check-ins every other day, or I do check-ins 3 times a week, that's a good thing. It's a good thing. And I'm not going to tell you that what you're doing is wrong. But I am going to tell you, for most people, the healthiest thing is a daily check-in. That can be done through a phone call. It can be done through a text, but I'll be honest with you. I think texts are the least effective. Texts and emails are the least effective of any way that we might choose to check in with somebody. Phone calls are good. And for a long time, for those of us in recovery, phone calls were like cutting edge. Picking up that phone. Again, AA talks about that 500-pound telephone. So difficult to do when we're struggling to pick up that phone and make a call. But it's so important. For me personally, what I've found is that daily check-ins are important. And one of the tools that I use, one of the things that I use is an app called Marco Polo. I don't own any stock in Marco Polo. I don't make any money off of Marco Polo. But I'll tell you why I like Marco Polo for check-ins. A lot of times phone calls can be awkward. We have things come up where we're busy, or the person we're trying to check in with is busy. And sometimes can be difficult to connect. With Marco Polo is a video. Best way I know to describe it is almost like a video text. And I know I've already said I don't like text, but the reason I like Marco Polo is that on that app, I pick up my phone and I hit the button and I talk, and it records my face and my voice. And it sends that to the person that I'm checking in with. And so they hear my voice. Maybe they hear tension. Maybe they hear stress. Maybe they hear in my voice that I'm tired. Maybe they hear that I'm excited, that I'm content with where things are at. But in addition to that, they see my face. In a text, if somebody asks, "Hey, Ron, how are you doing?" and I text back, "Great," they still really don't have any idea what's going on inside of me. It can be a sarcastic text on my part. "Great, worst day I've ever lived in my life, man. Nothing's going right. It's going great." If they can hear my voice, they can maybe hear that sarcasm in my voice or hear that frustration in my voice. But when we add video to that, they can see my face and they can see the emotion in my face. When I do a check-in like that, and I check in with the 4 questions: what am I feeling? What am I thinking? What am I doing? What am I thinking of doing? I can do a check-in like that, and it doesn't take very long. Take me less than a minute. If I want to talk a little bit longer and share some specifics, I can do that. And then the person I'm sending it to, if they're busy, they can listen to it live while I'm sending it. But if they're busy right now, they can listen to it in 15 minutes or when they go on break in a little while, when they go on lunch. They can listen to it while they're on the drive to work or on the drive home. And as they listen, they hear my voice, they hear my emotion, but they see my face. And they see my face express what I am experiencing. And for me, when somebody does a check-in with me using that app, I can see their face. I can hear their voice. And I can know pretty well if things are going well or if they're struggling. And if they're struggling, then I can make a decision to pick up a phone and to give a call, to give them an opportunity to talk things out and to share things with me. Those daily check-ins are so important. For that person we're checking in with, they're important for me because in those check-ins and with those 4 things, especially what am I feeling, I have to voice what's going on in my head and in my heart. And when I speak that, when I voice that, just being able to speak that out brings that to the forefront. And I can actually experience some relief just in being able to speak that out. Daily check-ins are important. And these questions, these check-ins, if you use a different check-in format, I'm not going to argue with that at all. Use a format that you're comfortable with. Use a format that works for you. But these questions, as I do my check-in, these questions, speaking them out loud to another person, help me catch the process before the behavior happens, and it allows that person that I'm checking in with to catch the process and to speak into my life before the behavior happens. Because once I've acted out, I'm going to retreat in shame. I'm going to pull away. A lot of times when people check in that they have relapsed, or in times past when I've checked in that I've relapsed, and somebody will ask, who did you check that in with? Because usually I hear about it a day or two afterwards. And I'll ask, who did you check that in with? Sometimes what I hear is, well, I'm checking it in with you now. And my question is, my thought is, why have you waited a day or two to do that? Why have you bottled that up inside and carried that inside of you? Because when we carry that, when we don't share that with somebody else, we're already beginning that cycle for potential relapse to take place again. We have to interrupt that relapse process. We have to do something to intervene and to stop that process that's taking place. So for me, those daily check-ins, staying focused on those daily disciplines. When we notice early signs, I'm beginning to isolate, I'm beginning to back off on my daily disciplines, I'm not checking in regularly. When someone notices these early signs, then the goal becomes reconnection and honesty. Get out of that isolated state. Go to a meeting. It can be an in-person meeting. It can be there are meetings online all day, every day nowadays. Get into a meeting. Reach out to your sponsor. Talk to somebody. So steps, when we begin to notice those early signs, steps to avoid that relapse, number one, is tell somebody the truth. And we have to be honest about it. At times in my recovery, I run into somebody and they ask, how are you doing? I'm tempted just to say fine or good and walk away. But I may say, I'm struggling. But I try to stop there. I try not to get specific. We need to tell somebody the truth. Secrets fuel relapse. And so instead of saying I'm struggling, what we may say is, I'm feeling lonely, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling stressed out. And I'm telling myself that it might be a good idea for me to give in. We speak in honesty. Honesty interrupts relapse. A second step is we process our feelings and our emotions. Instead of numbing our feelings, we begin, if we don't know how to do it yet, we work on learning to name our feelings and emotions. That's a big step for a lot of people. In my recovery, in when I was in active addiction for years, I knew nothing about feelings. In fact, I used to brag. The only feeling I do well is anger. And when I got into recovery and began to learn about feelings, began to understand feelings and begin to process feelings, what I found out is I didn't do recovery. I didn't do anger well. I did rage pretty good, but rage is more closely connected to fear. I didn't want to admit I was afraid of anything. So instead of numbing feelings, we learned to name them. We learn to process them. I'm feeling angry. Who am I angry with? What am I angry about? Are there people or places, situations that are fueling that anger? I can tell you, there have been periods in my life where politics, going back to politics have been a big driver for me with anger. And there have been periods in my life as I processed my feelings. I'm in a point right now where some of the major news feeds that I have used for years, I've removed from my devices because I've recognized that some of those news feeds go out of their way to generate fear and anger, because fear and anger keeps us coming back. It may be that I begin to recognize that there are certain people who trigger specific feelings in me. Why is that happening? Do I need potentially to remove some relationships because they feed fear, they feed anger? So again, learning to process our feelings and emotions. What am I feeling? Being able to name it, being able to understand what that feeling is trying to communicate to me. What's the purpose of that feeling? And how do I respond to that feeling in a healthy way? So we tell somebody the truth, we process our emotions, and then number 3, we re-engage recovery practices. That might mean that I step back more consistently into meetings. Maybe you're not a meetings person. What that might mean is that you schedule to meet somebody for coffee and to be able to talk a couple times a week. You're not going to a meeting, but you're meeting with somebody that can be trusted, somebody that understands you, has an understanding of recovery, where you can be honest and where you can be open. It can mean that you engage recovery practices like meeting with a coach, maybe going to therapy. Therapy's played an important role in my recovery. It can be practices like journaling. I would even encourage you with your journaling. I hated journaling for a lot of my life. Those 4 check-in questions that I've mentioned are now included in my daily journaling. What am I feeling? What am I thinking? What am I doing? And what am I thinking about doing? And I write that out. I journal that. And those recovery practices can be things like prayer or meditation. And a recovery practice can be something as simple as making sure that I'm getting an adequate amount of sleep. And then number 4, the 4th step in interrupting the relapse process. And again, we tell the truth to somebody. We have somebody that we can talk to and be honest with. We process our emotions and our feelings. What am I feeling? What's the purpose in this feeling? Where's it coming from? What's it trying to communicate to me? We re-engage our recovery practices, things like meeting, coaching, therapy, journaling, prayer, and meditation. And then number 4 is we reduce, in general, across the board, isolation. This can be things as simple as regular phone calls, meeting somebody in a coffee shop. In fact, there was a long period, everybody that knows me knows I spend a lot of time in coffee shops. Coffee shops are a good place for me. I have one coffee shop that I hang out at a lot, Culkin Coffee in New Albany, Indiana. If you're ever in New Albany, Indiana, swing by and see me. Odds are I'm going to be there. Text me. I'll let you know if I'm there or not. But I've hung out in that coffee shop for years now. And because of that, there are people that I know that come in and out. We interact. Sometimes it's a simple nod. Sometimes we speak. Sometimes somebody will pull up a chair for a few minutes and we'll talk. But we look for ways to reduce isolation. Addiction grows in secrecy. Addiction grows always in isolation. Recovery grows in connection. What's that saying, Blast? I think you're still in here. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is healthy community, healthy connection. We move away from isolation. Now, relapse, again, going back to what I said at the beginning. Relapse rarely begins with behavior. If you've relapsed recently, you need to ask yourself, you need to sit down with a notebook and process through. Where did this begin? Where did this begin? Did it begin with practices that I began to step away from, not be as committed to? Did it begin as I stopped talking openly and honestly with people? Did it begin as I began to isolate and to withdraw? Relapse rarely begins with behavior. It usually begins with disconnection, isolation, and unprocessed emotions. What have I been feeling? And we process this in a notebook. In fact, I would encourage you, if a relapse takes place, I would say even if a close call takes place, if you find yourself contemplating, considering a relapse or acting out in some way, sit down and process these things. What areas have I been neglecting? Am I interacting with people openly and honestly? And that it may be that you're still going to meetings. You're just not opening up and talking to anybody about the things that are going on inside your head and your heart. What am I feeling? I'm struggling big time with loneliness. I'm struggling with pressure and stress that's going on at work. I'm in the middle of a move. I'm in the middle of a job change. For some people, I've been having to do some travel for work. I told you I'm in St. Louis right now. This is not home. My home is Southern Indiana. And I'm here in St. Louis. I'm actually here with family. I'm here spending time with some grandkids while they're on spring break. But you know what? My schedule is shot to pieces. I'm not following my consistent, regular schedule that I normally have. I have a Monday night meeting that I'm in every week. I didn't make that meeting last night. I wasn't able to be there. That affects me. And so, in an instance like this, I can plan ahead because I know what stressors are coming. But let's say I was at home and I'm beginning to find myself struggle. I have to process those things. I need to write them out. If we can begin to learn to recognize those early signs, then most always, I won't make a blanket statement always, but most always, we will be able to change the direction that we're moving in long before the behavior and the relapse happens. Now, I have a question for you as I close tonight. We're coming up here on the end. Again, if you end up having thoughts or you have questions, feel free to drop something in the comments here. This will be on YouTube later. Feel free to drop something in the comments there. Questions, comments. Feel free to shoot me an email, rwcoaching2@gmail.com, or visit my website, rw-coaching.com. Reach out to me. But here's my question. Here's my thought for you as we close today. Looking back on past relapses, I don't care if the relapse has been this week, if it's been this month. I don't care if your last relapse was a few years ago. My challenge for you is to look back on past relapses and ask yourself, consider, process. When do you think that relapse process really began? And what was involved? Can you see where you were beginning to isolate? Can you identify areas, routines in your recovery that you were beginning to neglect? Were you maintaining safe community where you could be open and honest? Were you processing your emotions and your feelings? Thinking back on past relapses, when do you think the process really began? I want to thank you for being here with me this evening. I want to invite you back next week. I'll be back next Tuesday evening. I'll be back home next Tuesday. Have my bookcases behind me and all that kind of thing. But I'll be back next Tuesday evening. And coming up in April, I'll have a guest from the Louisville Police Department that will be here to talk about the relationship between addiction and crime, and specifically between addiction and homelessness. We'll talk about those things. Thanks for being here tonight. I'd invite you to subscribe, to follow me here, subscribe to my YouTube if you haven't yet. And if you think this talk, this discussion here this evening would be beneficial for somebody you know, feel free to share it. It'll be up here on Facebook for 30 days. But by tomorrow morning, it'll be on my YouTube channel, RW Coaching, and it'll be up there permanently. Feel free to share with anybody that might benefit from something that we've talked about here this evening. Thanks for being with me, and I'll see you guys next week for Let's Talk Recovery.